Evelyn's arrival at the ranch was nothing like the hopeful beginning she had tried to imagine. Instead, it felt like the last fragile thread, holding her together, had finally snapped. She stepped down from the wagon wearing a dress someone else had picked for her, a dress that was supposed to make her look composed and worthy, but all it did was cling to the trembling of a woman who had been pushed too far. Dust clung to the hem as she lifted her skirt, her hands shaking despite her desperate attempt to appear calm. She had practiced her smile on the long journey, hoping to hide the storm inside her chest, but the moment she saw the cowboy, waiting broad-shouldered, steady-eyed and far too kind-looking, her breath hitched and everything she'd been holding back came rushing up her throat like a dam breaking. Her past clung to her. A broken engagement that became the town's cruel entertainment, a family who blamed her without pause or mercy, and a future she'd been told she didn't deserve. She tried to blink away the tears, to force her face into something presentable, but the truth refused to be hidden any longer. A single tear slipped down her cheek, then another, until she stood before him openly crying, humiliated and furious at her own weakness. She turned away, ashamed that she couldn't even arrive as the bride she had promised to be. But instead of recoiling or looking disappointed, the cowboy Cole Harding approached her with a gentleness she wasn't prepared for. His boots stopped right beside her, and when she finally dared to lift her gaze, he wasn't frowning or confused. He looked understanding, as though he saw her pain before she ever spoke a word. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and when she didn't, he brushed her cheek with the side of his thumb, wiping away a tear she never meant him to see. His voice was low and steady, a warmth she hadn't expected from a stranger. "You don't have to pretend with me," he murmured, and something inside hers, something crushed for far too long, unraveled completely. In that single sentence, Cole offered her more comfort than anyone had in years. The permission to be herself, to be real, and to be broken without shame. Cole Harding hadn't known what kind of woman would step off that wagon, but he certainly hadn't expected someone whose spirit looked as though it had been quietly bruised by life itself. The moment he saw Evelyn's trembling hands, and the way she tried to gather herself, he understood more than she said. Years of reading weather, horses, and human pain had taught him to recognize storms long before they broke. Most men would have judged a bride who arrived with red-rimmed eyes and a voice that couldn't form a steady greeting. But Cole wasn't like most men, and the sight of her vulnerability stirred in him a protective instinct he'd never felt so sharply. As he helped her down, his hands were gentle, careful, as though she were carrying invisible wounds he didn't want to worsen. He didn't ask why she cried or what troubles she brought. He simply offered the steadiness she so clearly needed, speaking softly, as if raising his voice might shatter her further. He noticed the way she kept her shoulders hunched, as though bracing for disappointment or criticism, and it angered him quietly that someone had made her believe she had to hide herself. Her beauty wasn't in the perfect smile she tried to force, but in the raw honesty of her tears, and Cole found himself wanting to shield that honesty, not suppress it. As he guided her toward the cabin, he matched her pace, letting her breathe, giving her space without letting her feel alone. "You're safe here," he told her, meaning every word, and the softness in his voice made Evelyn's steps falter, as if she wasn't accustomed to being spoken to gently. He didn't look at her like a burden or a disappointment. He looked at her like someone worth standing beside. With every moment he spent near her, it became clearer that Evelyn carried a heaviness she'd been forced to bear without kindness, and though she didn't speak her story yet, Cole silently promised himself that her future wouldn't resemble the pain written in her eyes. In that quiet walk toward his home, something unspoken settled between them, a fragile trust, a tiny spark of hope, and neither of them fully understood it yet, but it was enough to begin healing what life had broken. When Evelyn stepped into Cole's cabin, she expected the same coldness and formality she'd grown up with, but instead she was met with a warmth that made her chest tighten, as if her heart didn't know how to handle gentleness anymore. The little home was modest handmade furniture, a stone hearth flickering with soft firelight, a quilt draped over a worn couch, but it felt inviting in a way no place ever had for her. She hovered at the doorway for a long moment, almost afraid to take another step, afraid the peace she felt might shatter if she moved too quickly. Cole watched her quietly, leaning against the table, arms crossed, not in impatience but in a quiet patience that made her throat ache. "It ain't fancy," he said with a small shrug, "but it's honest." Evelyn ran her fingers across the smooth wooden table, touched the wildflowers in a chipped jar flowers someone had gathered with care. Not for show but simply because they brought a little beauty into a lonely room. She'd never lived anywhere that felt like someone had tried to make it gentle. Homes in her past had always been filled with expectations, sharp words, rooms that looked perfect but felt empty. But here the air felt softer. The silence didn't feel like judgment. And for a moment, she felt herself breathing fully, as if she'd been holding her breath for months. Cole's gaze followed her as she explored, not with ownership or expectation, but with something that looked startlingly close to admiration. The smallness of the cabin didn't bother her. In fact, it made her feel grounded, safe, like she could finally unclench her heart. "Honest is enough," she whispered, surprised by how true it felt. And as Cole's lips curved into a slow warm smile, Evelyn realized something she hadn't dared hope for. She wasn't just stepping into a house, she was stepping into the first place that felt like it might one day become a home. That night, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Evelyn sat across from Cole with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to keep her past contained like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. For hours she had tried to hold herself together, afraid that if she told him the truth, he would see her the way everyone else had, flawed, unwanted, a burden. But the quiet warmth of the cabin and the steady calm in Cole's eyes slowly unraveled the knots inside her, until the weight of her silence became unbearable. Her voice trembled as she finally began to speak, each word scraped raw from wounds she had never been allowed to show. How her fiancé had left her humiliated at the altar, how her own family had whispered that she deserved it, how her father told her she was unwanted goods, and how her mother had warned her never to return unless she came back married, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be traded away. Evelyn expected the cowboy to recoil in pity or discomfort, the way others always did when faced with her pain. But Cole's reaction startled her into stillness. His jaw tightened, not in anger at her, but in a fierce, protective fury for her anger that someone had taken a gentle woman and made her believe she was unworthy of kindness. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low and firm as he said, "They were wrong." The words struck her harder than any insult ever had, not because they hurt, but because they offered a truth she had never been given permission to believe. "You deserved better, Evelyn. You still do." The firelight cast warm shadows across his face, but it was the sincerity in his eyes that made her breath catch. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was confessing something shameful. She felt like someone was lifting the weight with her. In that moment, surrounded by the glow of the fire and Cole's steady presence, Evelyn felt a quiet shift inside her, a flicker of dignity, fragile but finally alive again. "You said, empath." Cole hadn't meant to share his own past, but as he watched Evelyn shrink under the weight of her memories, something inside him stirred a deep recognition, a quiet echo of the loneliness he had carried for so long. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to speak words he usually kept locked away. He told her how he'd lost his parents when he was still just a boy, how the ranch had become both his refuge and his prison, how he'd grown up believing that needing anyone made a man weak. He spoke haltingly at first, unused to being vulnerable. But the longer he talked, the more he realized Evelyn was listening not out of obligation but understanding. He told her how he had built the ranch with his own hands, convincing himself that hard work would fill the emptiness, but every evening the silence would return, reminding him he had no one to share the world he'd built. Evelyn watched him with a softness he wasn't used to, her eyes not filled with pity but with a kind of compassion that wrapped around him like warm hands. "I don't know how to be perfect either," he admitted quietly, rubbing the back of his neck, "but I can be real." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and honest. Evelyn felt something open inside her at that confession, a gentle ache, the kind that comes from recognizing a familiar wound in someone else. She realized Cole wasn't offering her rescue or expecting her to heal overnight. He was offering companionship in the places where they both felt painfully human. In his honesty, she saw a man who had learned to survive alone, but was finally ready to let someone in. And in her eyes, Cole saw something he hadn't expected to find: a woman who didn't judge him for his scars, but stood quietly beside them. It wasn't love yet, not fully, but it was the undeniable beginning of something tender, something real, something neither of them had dared to hope for. In the days that followed, life settled into a gentle rhythm, that felt almost like healing, disguised as routine. Evelyn woke each morning to the soft sounds of Cole moving around the ranch. The quiet clink of tools, the low murmur he used when talking to the horses, the steady rhythm of his boots across the wooden porch, and each sound wrapped around her like a promise that she wasn't here alone anymore. She learned quickly that Cole was a man of quiet habits. He hummed under his breath when he worked, paused every afternoon to wipe the sweat from his brow with the same old handkerchief, and always checked on her first before tending to anything else. In return, Cole discovered that Evelyn had her own tender patterns. She cooked with slow, deliberate care, arranging ingredients like they mattered. She laughed softly when the ranch dog tripped over its own paws. She pressed her fingers against the windowpane whenever she worried, tracing invisible shapes only she understood. Their connection grew not through grand gestures, but through the simple, shared moments. The way their hands brushed when passing a cup, the way Cole guided her through ranch chores with patient instruction, the way Evelyn began leaving small touches of warmth throughout the cabin, fresh wildflowers on the table, mended quilts folded neatly, bread that filled the home with a comforting smell. They moved around each other like two people learning the steps of a slow, hesitant dance, neither rushing nor forcing the other. Every evening, they ended the day sitting on the porch, watching the sun melt behind the hills in a wash of gold. Cole would tilt his hat back, relaxing in a way he never had before she arrived, while Evelyn found herself leaning just a little closer with each passing sunset. In those quiet shared moments, their unspoken bond grew strong-built, not on obligation but on trust, kindness, and the tender realization that they both had finally found someone who cared enough to notice the smallest parts of them. It was the kind of closeness that didn't feel dramatic or rushed. It felt natural, inevitable, like two lonely lives slowly stitching themselves into one. Just when Evelyn had begun to believe she could build a new life beside Cole, the past she'd tried so desperately to outrun found its way back to her in the form of a thin, cruel letter sealed with her family's familiar handwriting. She froze when she saw it, dread curling like a cold hand around her spine. With trembling fingers she unfolded the paper, and each sentence hit her like a blow. Her mother's sharp warning not to return unless she came back married, her father's reminder that she had already embarrassed them enough, and the final line insisting she not bring further shame to their name. All the confidence she had slowly begun to gather over the past few days scattered instantly, like fragile glass shattering at her feet. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, and the old familiar whispers returned. "You're a burden. You're not wanted. You'll never be enough." She crumpled the letter in her shaking hands, trying to hide her tears. But Cole was already beside her, his presence steady as a mountain. Without hesitation, he took the letter from her grip and tossed it into the fire, watching the flames consume the words that had haunted her for years. Evelyn stared at the burning paper, her breath jagged, her heart aching with old wounds reopened. "Maybe they were right about me," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of old scars. Cole stepped closer, cupping her face with both hands as if anchoring her back to the present. His thumb brushed her tears, not wiping them away, but accepting them. "No," he said, his tone steady, unwavering. "You listen to me now. I didn't ask for the perfect bride. I didn't ask for someone who pretends she's fine. I asked for you. The real you, tears and all." His voice wrapped around her like a shield she'd never known she deserved. And for the first time, Evelyn felt the lies of her past begin to lose their power. In Cole's eyes, she saw not pity, not disappointment, but certainty that she was enough, exactly as she was. And in that moment, as the last scraps of the letter turned to ash, Evelyn felt something inside her shift. Not fully healed, not fully brave, but finally willing to believe she was worthy of the love being offered to her. The next morning dawned soft and golden, the kind of sunrise that made the whole world feel newly washed. And Evelyn stepped onto the porch to find Cole already waiting for her, hat in hand, eyes warm with a quiet certainty she had never seen directed at her before. She hesitated, still fragile from the echoes of yesterday, but Cole closed the distance with slow, steady steps, as if afraid to startle the fragile hope blooming in her chest. Taking her hands gently in his, he spoke in that low, reassuring voice she had grown to trust more than her own thoughts. "Evelyn," he murmured, "I don't want some version of you polished up to please the world. I don't want the woman they told you to be. I want you, the woman who cries when she's hurting, who laughs softly at the dog, who fills this home with warmth just by standing in it." His words wrapped around her like sunlight, dissolving the last shadows of doubt clinging to her heart. Tears filled her eyes. But for the first time they weren't born from shame or fear, they came from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, truly seen, without conditions. She squeezed his hands, her voice barely above a whisper as she answered, "Then you'll have her. All of her." Cole didn't reach for a ring or make some grand gesture. Instead, he bent his head and pressed a kiss to her, forehead slow, tender, reverencing, a promise deeper than vows spoken in a crowded church. In that small, powerful moment, they chose each other with complete honesty. Two wounded souls, deciding to build something gentle and lasting together. The ranch around them seemed to exhale with them, the fields stretching wide and open like the future they would share, and as Cole laced his fingers with hers, guiding her inside their home, not as strangers, not as obligations, but as partners, Evelyn finally felt what she had chased her entire life. A place she belonged, and a man who loved her not for pretending but for simply being the woman she truly was.